One of the most successful UK bands from the 60s to the present day is The Searchers, and I'm pleased to be speaking to the author of a new book, The Searchers' Crazy Dreams, 1963 to 2023, Peter Checksfield. Good afternoon, Peter.
Hello, Chris.
Now, Peter, we've just played The Searchers' Sweets for My Sweet, which was their first hit in 1963. Can you tell us about the song and their first album?
Yeah, sure. Well, the song was originally by the Drifters, and it was a slower tempo and more of a sort of semi-calypso, and they. The good thing, I mean, Frank Allen of the slightly later Searchers, he's touched on this before, and he said the Searchers were good at picking out the good bits, and sometimes they'd drop a verse or they'd, make simpler harmonies or change a chord, and they did make it simpler but much more commercial, and and it was their first big hit. I believe it got to number 2, yes.
And, of course, their first album was very successful as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, recorded very quickly. I mean, it's unbelievable these days, but, so often, in the 60s, they'd expect, 4 or 5 exclusive singles and then 2 albums a year and touring non-stop, 300 shows a year. But it's a very, very good album. Mellower stuff as well, even on their first couple of albums, a couple of folky stuff, and that's what made them stand out. They wasn't just doing the twist and shouts and the money and that everyone else was doing. They did those as well, but and so even then, I think they had a certain difference from most of the other bands around.
And did they write their own material?
To an extent, a bit later, Chris Curtis, the original drummer, was the first to start writing, and then and gradually, it was a long time coming, and they didn't really have the confidence. Most of them were B-sides or album tracks, but some very, very good songs.
And Peter, you've written a number of books regarding pop music. Why did you choose to write a book about the Searchers?
Normally, my books tend to be on various artists. I've done a couple on Top of the Pops, 2 volumes. I've done one on beat groups, one on glam rock. But the first one I did really devoted to one artist was the one before that, on Jerry Lee Lewis. And cut a long story short, I met him several times and know his family quite well. And I really enjoyed doing that, and it was well received. And then April, May, I saw the Searchers on their reunion stroke second farewell tour, or whatever they're calling it now, and they're touring again this year. But that was great at Folkestone. I got chatting to them, and I realised, although Frank Allen and Mike Pender, members, have written autobiographies, there's never been a book devoted to them. I mean, you can get lots of books on the Kinks or the Small Faces, and even Jerry and the Pacemakers. But so I just thought it was time, and I looked into it. I probably already had about 80% of everything, but then I seeked out a few more obscure things, and enjoyed it. Took about 3 months and come out really good.
It is a very interesting book, I must say, and there's things in that book that I never knew about the Searchers. So, it is a great book.
I sent an early manuscript to Mike Pender, John McNally and Frank Allen, and Mike Pender actually did a nice foreword, which was very good of him. But Frank Allen, I mean, he's very knowledgeable. People who's met him, he's very chatty. But I got the biggest compliment ever from Frank. He said, "I've learnt things in that I didn't know." And I thought that was fantastic. I thought, wow.
That's good. Yeah. And who were the original members of the Searchers?
Yeah, well, the original main singer, actually, on the first couple of songs, was Tony Jackson, the late Tony Jackson. It was John McNally on guitar, rhythm guitar, but he's still in the band now. He plays a lot more lead these days. Chris Curtis on drums, and Mike Pender, or Mike Pender MBE as he is now.
Yes. And then from the years 1963 to 1964, what did the band get up to?
Yeah, well, they had Sweets from My Sweet, and then they had a very similar record, Sugar and Spice. They stumbled on the Jackie D. Shannon song, Needles and Pins, and it was actually Frank. They discovered it via Frank Allen. He was in Cliff Bennett and the Rebel Rousers at the time, and they was performing it, and not particularly good version, actually, to be fair, but But the other searchers, especially Chris Curtis, saw sort of potential in it. And then, first of all, they tried recording it with Tony Jackson, who was the main lead singer, but they found his voice was a bit too harsh. And then they went for the softer tones, and Mike Pender pretty much became the lead vocalist on the records after that, which caused some tension. But they did the right thing. Mike Pender, fantastic guitarist, and really did have the voice for more mellow stuff like that.
Right, we're going to play that song now, The Searchers and Needles and Pins.
Today, I see needles and pins, needles and pins.
That was The Searchers and Needles and Pins. Now, going on to 1964, the Beatles were very successful, but The Searchers were one of the probably the most popular bands behind the Beatles at the time.
Yeah, I'd say up there with Jerry and the Pacemakers, although his career, he had 3 number ones, and his career quickly petered out, as a hit artist anyway. And the Searchers, I'd say number 2, certainly up to 65, yeah.
And looking at obviously their success, they were touring. Were they touring as the headline band?
Oh yeah, to an extent. There was a lot of package shows at the time, even with big stars. I mean, cut a long story short, I'm working on a book on the Tremolos, but their first big tour after their first big hit, they was on a bill with the Hollies, the Spencer Davis Group, and Paul Jones, and what a bill, all 4 of them, so exactly, and they do about 20 minutes each, and that was more of the sort of tours that the Searchers would have done at the time,
Yes, and the Beatles did in '63. They did the Winter Gardens in Margate, and yes, they did a 20-minute set.
Yeah, exactly. With I think Billy J. Kramer was there. Was
That's
Jerry
right.
and the Pacemakers?
It was, yes. So obviously a very similar lineup to what the Searchers were used to. Looking back to 65, 66 and 67, the hits kept coming for the Searchers. Was there any time that the Searchers perhaps were finding things a little bit difficult?
Well, they went through 2 major lineup changes through it. As I said, Tony Jackson was the original lead singer on the first couple of singles, and very much dominates the first 2 albums. But by the 3rd album, he had 1 lead vocal, and this was in early 1964. And this was just 8 months after into their career, and suddenly the lead singer, he's very very much sidelined, and he didn't get on with Chris Curtis, the drummer, who was pretty much the leader. He made all the decisions, and he left to form his own band, Tony Jackson and the Vibrations. And then they got Frank Allen, who was in Cliff Bennett and the Rebel Rousers and still with them today, and recorded perhaps their best known hit, When You Walk in the Room.
Yes. And of course, then soon after that, Chris Curtis left. Yeah,
in 1966, they was on tour in Australia, supporting the Rolling Stones, actually, on tour in Australia in 1966. And the Searchers were very, and still are, quite notable for being quite clean living, and never been drinkers and never been druggers, really. But Chris Curtis got into just mild drugs, a bit speed, perhaps some cannabis, and he was always mildly eccentric, though, and I think this just made things worse, and it all come to a head. Apparently, the other Searchers flushed his drugs down the loo in a hotel in Australia, and he went crazy and said, "Right, I'm quitting the band." And they tried to persuade him otherwise on the flight home, but that was it. And Chris Curtis left, and they got in a young London mod, John Blunt. But Chris Curtis, he did make most of the decisions, and once Chris Curtis left, the hits pretty much dried up.
So in the 70s, we didn't hear too much of the Searchers, did we?
No. They released the occasional record, but they was touring all the time. First of all, at the Chicken and Basket cabaret clubs, but then later on, once the revivals kicked in, they did a big revival tour in America as early as 1973, a 60s revival tour, which seems crazy now, just a few years after the event. And that was on tour with Wayne Fontana and the Mind Benders and Herman's Hermits. and gradually, they got more into these 60s packages and everything, and And they did a couple of great albums for Sire Records in 1979 and 1981, very acclaimed. Unfortunately, acclaimed didn't lead to good big sales, big record sales. But even now, the people who listen to them, they somehow managed to sound modern, but without changing their sound too much. They had the jangly guitars, which people like the Pretenders were playing at the time. It was, and Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. The music had almost come full circle, and they were hip again. But although their music sounded hip, it wasn't hip to be a searcher.
Yes, and they did have a very distinctive sound, didn't they?
Very much so. As much as any other group, probably more than most 60s group, they very quickly developed their own sound, their own softer harmonies and the jangly guitars, We're
going to play another Searchers song, Walk in the Room. That was the Searchers and Walk in the Room. In the 80s, some dramatic change for the Searchers. How did, first of all, Mike Pender and Frank Allen get on?
I think Mike Pender and Frank Allen, actually got along quite well. The tension was more between Mike Pender and John McNally, I believe. And both original members. They'd known each other since school days. They really had. But who knows what goes on the road? And I suppose that they spent more time together because Frank lived in London or near London, and so did the drummer at the time. But their drive back together in gigs, because they both lived in Liverpool still, and and I suppose the tensions just got too much. And Mike Pender is painted as a bit of a bad guy, but I can see two sides. There's two sides to every story, of course. But what happened was they was on tour, and they went to their hotel, and they knew the person who was running this hotel quite well. And someone spoke to Frank and said, can you keep a secret? He said, yeah, sure. He just thought it was something trivial. And he said, Mike's leaving the band. What? Yeah. And then he kept his secret, couldn't tell John. And then gradually John did find out, and there was a lot of tension. And then, Mike left to form his own spin-off band, and and ever since then, until Mike Pender retired about 2 years ago, there's been two Searchers. There's been the Searchers with John and Frank, and Mike Pender's Searchers.
Did he ever say why he left the band?
He pretty more or less explains it in his biography, which is as good as Frank's book in a way. It's a very good book. Some people say he looked at people like Wayne Fontana and Jerry Marsden, who'd go out with just a pickup band and call them the Mindbenders or the Pacemakers, and they'd get all the money or most of the money. And some say he did it for those reasons, and perhaps there's some truth to that as well. But probably a mixture of that and just rising tensions. Artistic differences perhaps.
Yes, because it was once Mike Pender left, it was billed as Mike Pender, wasn't it?
He was sued a couple of times. Not necessarily his fault. It billed himself as Mike Pender's Searchers, but some people on the posters, they'd put the Searchers and perhaps put Mike Pender so small you can't see it. And for a couple of years, people would go to gigs, they didn't know which band they'd be seeing.
And who took over lead vocals when Mike left?
Yeah, it was a young guy at the time. He's 70 now, actually. Spencer James. He was in a band in the 70s called First Class, who had a hit with Beach Baby. It was quite a good choice. Although he looked very different, he looked younger, more trendy. He could have come straight out of Duran Duran sort of thing at the time. And Yeah, but a nice guy, confident, but in a quiet, sort of relaxed manner. Not egotistical, and a very strong voice. A great guitarist and quite a good songwriter as well. So, and he's still there. 38 years later.
Yes, yeah, and obviously Frank Allen and John McNally are still part of the band as well.
Very much so. They've gone through a few drummers. I didn't put it in the book. I almost compared it to Spinal Tap with all the disappearing drummers, because they've been through about 6 or 7 drummers, but otherwise been reasonably steady. Yes, I think.
Yes, and obviously they continued touring. I was lucky enough to work with the Searchers through the 90s on about 7 occasions, I think, and they were a really nice bunch of chaps. But the other thing was they were so professional, and their sound was brilliant, and I used to fill the Winter Gardens and places like that, which was great.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, they really are. Yeah, Frank in particular, he's very approachable. Well, they all are to an extent, but Frank is the chatty one. John's a bit quieter, but they're great guys, and so is Mike. Actually, I don't like him being painted as a bad guy, because he is a nice guy. He really is. He's good to fans and everything as well. Yeah, so.
Well, Mike Pender got an MBE.
Yeah. When I was researching this, I didn't forget. I did have it in the back of my mind, but I asked him, the Searchers, they've never got in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Surely they should be. And he said, many people have said that, but he said, at least on his part, he got an MBE, and he said, that was because of Searchers, because of his work for the Searchers. And I also must add, Mike Pender privately, he talks nicely about Frank Allen, and Frank Allen privately talks nice about Mike Pender. I think the big bugbear for whenever getting back together, and perhaps he's got his own reasons, John McNally. I think he still holds a big grudge there.
That's a shame, and also sadly the media do like to perhaps exaggerate things slightly.
Exactly.
Things like that.
They do.
They like a little bit of controversy. Yeah. The Searchers also did many TV programmes and a bit of film work as well.
Yeah, they did. There was a movie called Saturday Night Out in the early 60s. Yeah, they was in that, and they made the mistake. That was the only time they did it. Normally, as you probably know, a lot of artists, even if they're covering songs that's written by someone else, they'd write the B-side because they get the royalties. But this Saturday Night Out, it was written by their manager, Tony Hatch. And they thought, let's promote the movie and put that on the B-side of Needles and Pins. And they've lost out on a small fortune over the years because they didn't have their own composition on the back of Needles and Pins. So, but it was an interesting appearance. And, and TV shows, of course, there was on Ready, Steady, Go and Top of the Pops and Thank Your Lucky Stars, and all these other legendary shows,
It's so fascinating, and they are such a great band. And obviously you said they toured, this year actually they did, didn't they? They did some touring this year. You saw them at Folkestone. Are they going to continue?
Well, yes. They did a so-called farewell tour in 2019, and I remember chatting to Frank during lockdown, and I said, do you regret, doing it? And he said, I chose just the right time. Imagine trying to keep a band together during lockdown and paying wages and crew and everything. But then, they got itchy feet or itchy fingers again, and then they went out on the road this year. And then, about a month ago, they announced another third farewell tour, goodbye tour, thank you tour, whatever they're calling it, next year.
Oh, that's great.
It is great, it is. Yeah.
And hopefully they'll be coming to Kent.
Yeah, they are. They're going to the Marlow Canterbury this year.
Oh,
yeah.
Great.
Or next year, rather. There was at Folkestone this year. Yeah. Obviously, the Winter Gardens doesn't exist anymore.
No, sadly
which is a bugbear to me. I worked there.
And me.
Oh, did you? Oh.
Well, I performed there many times.
I was a doorman there for a few years. I met a lot of them.
I'd love to see the Winter Gardens get back to its former glory. So we keep our fingers crossed as far as that's concerned. Your book is The Searchers, The Crazy Dreams, from 63 to 23. It's Peter Checksfield. How can people buy your book?
From the biggest bookstore in the world, Amazon. Yeah, well, anywhere in the world. The good thing about Amazon, literally, I upload the manuscript, it gets approved, and 2 days later, someone in Japan's got it in their hands. It's incredible, really. It really is. So, I tend to do my books through Amazon, but you'll get it through there. I've also got a website. Just Google my name, Peter Checksfield, and if you don't do Amazon or you're struggling to get it, wherever you are in the world, I'll help you.
Well, Peter, thank you for an interesting insight to one of the UK's greatest bands, The Searchers. Thank you for speaking to us today.
Thank you, Chris.
That concludes the Light Lunch. Coming next on Academy FM is Phil Billy.
Sugar and spice and all things nice. Kisses sweeter than